Welcome. It's great to see you all here this morning. I'm Marianne Borg, and my friend and colleague Bill Ellis, and I will help facilitate a conversation today. I'm just delighted with the response to the invitation to come and continue a conversation that actually started with Michael Morwood with an event that he had here in June. How many of you were here for Michael Morwood? Okay, great. As you know, it's not a requirement to have heard him to come here. But Michael talked, the title of his talk was Seeing Jesus Through a 21st Century Lens. He talked about the fact that we are in what he considers to be the greatest transition of social and religious history ever, that we are at an important pivotal time, and every age I think should think of itself as the pivotal age. But he suggests, and I actually agree, that we are at a really crucial time in our human history and in our planetary history. And I am not a hair on fire kind of person, but the stakes are high in terms of our human future and the future of this planet. And so Michael, who lives in Australia, and he's been around the country and around the world talking about religion and God and how we might see things through a 21st century lens. He sort of sparked a lot of conversation. From that event, I got a lot of feedback saying, can we continue this conversation and have opportunities to gather and just do some exploring together? So because of that prompt, we did a little exploration. We thought, yes, let's continue the conversation. And that's exactly what we want to do today. I'm going to give a little bit of from my own perspective on what I think are some of the issues around what we might call progressive Christianity and some kind of foundational understandings for continuing the conversation around religion and meaning in the 21st century. Bill is going to respond to me, and I'm going to look forward to you responding as well. So I'm thrilled at the response. And I think that this certainly is a reflection of the fact that we all need a place to come and talk and explore and wonder and imagine, maybe redefine, reconstruct, and help each other live forward and help to make the world a better place. So I am delighted to see you all. I want to thank Trinity Church Bend for making the space available. We're actually the Marcus J. Borg Foundation, which is sponsoring this. We're renting the space, so this is not an event of Trinity Church, but they are certainly allies and partners in this conversation. So I'm very appreciative of the fact that we can meet here in this space. So thanks to Trinity. I also want to thank Gail McGuire and Jeannie McBurnett for all that they have done to provide hospitality and coffee and so forth. So thanks to you and for helping to get the word out. Let me tell you about the shape of the morning. I'll do a little bit of talking head about some of my own thoughts. Then, and that'll probably be about 35, 40 minutes. I'm going to have Bill respond. He and I are, as I said, friends and colleagues. We see things similarly, but not necessarily the same. Let me say at the outset, but we shall see. And we may not all see things the same here in this room, and that's actually part of the pleasure of this. Progressive Christianity, or, that's just sort of shorthand for how do we understand ourselves in the 21st century context. It is not one thing. So it's not like, out with the old, in with the new, or now this is our new belief system or whatever. I don't want to suggest that, quote unquote, progressive Christianity, and as I said, that shorthand, is one thing. But I think that where we are in Christianity and in the other great historical religious traditions, we're at a really important time when the question is being called, on what do we believe and why, what do we think of humanity, what do we think is possible, who is responsible. I mean, I think the question is being called on meaning making, and our part in it as we move ahead. Okay. And there is not one answer to this, but I'm hoping that in this setting that we can find ways to help each other articulate our concerns and even our convictions and our wonderment. Bill will respond to some of the things that I'm going to say, and that'll probably be about 15 or 20 minutes, something like that. We'll see how the timing goes. We'll take a break at 10:15. At 10:15, there are restrooms. There are restrooms. You can ask Jeannie and Gail if you need some directions, but they're right here on this level. And that'll be a great time for tea and coffee and snack break. And at 10:30, we'll reconvene. And at that point, I'm going to invite you to have some response to what you've heard this morning. Okay? And then we'll close today by 11:30. So, let me start by making a bit of a case for religion. Religion has kind of a pejorative. I think people think of it kind of negatively. I'm spiritual, not religious. Do you remember who said that? Monica Lewinsky. Do you remember Monica Lewinsky? Actually, I think that she made that phrase kind of semi-famous when she was interviewed by Barbara Walters, and she said, no, I'm not religious. I'm spiritual. And so I think religion tends to have kind of a pejorative association. But I want to make a case for the function of religion as we get started here. The word religions, the root for that means to bind or to tie together, religare or religere. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but it means to bind or to tie together. And some people immediately assume that that's negative, that religions bind you or limit you to a certain belief and so on and so on. I don't think that's the intent of the word religion. Religions are, let me say at the outset, are human constructions. They're human constructions. Einstein, for one, says that religion is a deep human instinct. And Jung says that religion is part of the functioning of the unconscious. So religion and coming up with religions is something that we humans do. And we have from the get-go. And I would suggest that whatever we call it, we humans will continue to create religious schemas or frameworks to help us understand the world, our own humanity, and mortality. And so religion is an effort to tie or bind together some kind of narrative or some kind of coherence to address our puzzlements and mind bafflements and questions and wonders and concerns about the world, about our humanity, and about mortality. Okay? And religions, as I said, it's a deep human, with Einstein on this, a deep human instinct to try to construct a narrative or a worldview or an understanding that helps us live and to help us live with meaning. And as you all know, we human beings are meaning-making and world-making creatures. And that's part of our greatness. It's part of our responsibility. And it's also part of our challenge. Okay? There's a more ancient understanding of the word religion, religere, G-E-R-E instead of G-A-R-E. And that more ancient root understanding of the word religion means to pay particular attention. And I love that. That religions are the act, the instinct, the creation of paying particular attention to what is. again, to world, to humans, to our mortality. And the opposite, if you will, of to pay particular attention is to neglect, or to be blind, or to not see. Okay. So I would suggest that religions have a really important function in our history making, and also potentially in the future of humankind, and if you will, the future of God. So I want to make a case for the importance of religions, and for us to not just assume that religion means belief in 47 impossible things before breakfast. Okay. That it's a deep, or how many? It was only 7? Yeah. Well, you're behind the times a little bit, Bill. I think it's up to 47 now. Was it the Queen of Hearts and Alice in Wonderland? Yes. So I hyperbole a bit, but so I just wanted to make a statement about where I'm coming from when I think about religion, because I think religion is a really important part of our human history, and will continue to be. Okay, let me mention a couple of things that I think are kind of givens now about whatever progressive Christianity. How are we talking about Christianity? And I'm going to refer specifically to Christianity today. What are some suppositions about Christianity as we talk about it in the 21st century? Let me make a statement about the Bible. The Bible is a human product. It is not a dictation from some other source. And I think in this 21st century world, in our educated world, we understand that the Bible is a human product, that it is more our stories about God, if you will, than God's stories about us. Okay. The Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, they are ancient documents from ancient communities who understood what they could within their worldview, within what they knew, and what they didn't know. And they, like the rest of us, are trying to make sense of how we understand our place in the world and things that happen. And because so much is, why do bad things happen to good people? Wars, pestilence, hate, resentment, killing, love, grace, serendipity, wonder, magic, dying, rising, the unexpected, the uncontrollable. I mean, the Bible, and I would say all ancient sacred texts, are stories about how we experience the world and what kind of sense we try to make of it. So our ancient, our New Testament and our Old Testament are stories about what people knew and what they didn't, and how they try to explain their experience of God and their own humanity and their own mortality. The Bible was not written for us. It was not written for us. That does not mean that it can't speak to us today. And the reason that I say that is because so much of what the Bible talks about is the human condition. And that has not changed all that much over the centuries. So the Bible continues to speak to us because, to borrow a category from David Tracy, the Bible addresses classic concerns and situations of the human condition. I think that most of the healing stories and miracle stories in the New Testament, for instance, are more metaphorical stories about big issues than necessarily particular events. I'm not going to unpack that this morning. That's something we can talk about anytime. But let me just take, for example, Jesus walking on the water. Okay? Did Jesus really walk on the water? Who knows? Is that a way of saying somehow Jesus went through the uncertainties of life and the undertow didn't pull him out? How is it that Jesus could walk through life with all of its uncertainties and chaos, and yet the undertow didn't get him? Now, I would suggest that a thought like that, this thought that I've suggested about what the Jesus walking on the water might mean, that is something that can continue to speak to us today, and when we can wonder, what was it about Jesus that would produce a story that would say that the undertow of life, he was able to not be overwhelmed. I suggest that story is more about that than it was about whether he could literally walk on water. And let me also suggest that if he did literally walk on water, what good does that do me? Okay, so I'm just throwing that out there as a way of suggesting there are ways to listen to the stories of our scripture. I think it's important always for us to ask, why is the story told this way? Who's telling the story? Or to whom is the story being told? Who's the audience for a story? And I think that once we start to see and hear the stories with that kind of layering, they become alive for us in a totally different way. The Bible stories tell us a lot about us and how we try to make sense of us and God. And Old Testament, New Testament are ancient communities expressing their experience. They appeal to the imagination. These stories appeal to the imagination. They're not strict histories. They're more metaphorical narratives, which is one reason they continue to speak to us today. Okay? So I just want to say at the outset that for 21st century Christians, one of the things that we say is that the Bible is a human product. Okay. Let me say a little bit about Jesus. As you all know, there have been, I think, 3 quests for the historical Jesus, and there's always been this tension between Jesus as a human being and Jesus as divine. I would suggest that Jesus' real value to us, then and now, is his humanity. Jesus didn't become divinized until after the 4th century. Okay? And there are lots of reasons why that happened. We won't try to unpack that today either. It can come up in conversation, but I'm not going to unpack it myself today. But there are reasons why Jesus became more and more divine the longer he was gone. And it is not completely divorced from the divine right of kings, as it was understood in the ancient world. Okay? Who is Lord? Caesar or Jesus? Okay. I think that Jesus' great, part of his greatness is that he shows us our capacity as human beings. He shows us our capacity as human beings. He stood for something. He embodied an understanding of reality. He had a deep, intimate understanding and sense of God. He stood actually against a domination system that was that put most of the population in a oppressive situation. He stood against that. I have no doubt that he was a healer. And what does that mean? We're still talking about him 2,000 years later. There was something about the man. And I suggest, as 21st century Christians, one of the things that is important for us to understand and claim is the importance of Jesus' humanity. I had a good friend. She used to be a Methodist. She's a Sufi now. But I remember she said to me, if Jesus was divine, and that's the big, it's like, well, Jesus was Son of God, whatever we think that means, that if Jesus was divine, and that's our saving grace, is that he was, she said, if he was divine, how does that help me? Now, we may have a narrative that says how that helps us. But I was really struck by her comment. It's sort of like the walking on water thing. If he can walk on water, good for him, but what does that do for me? If Jesus is divine, good for him, but what does that have to do with me? I think that one of the undervalued things about Jesus was his humanity and the importance of his humanity. I also will suggest, and this is a little controversial. No, heretofore we've been just smoothing right along. This little comment that I'm going to make might make some people bristle. And that is Jesus as the Christ. Okay? Jesus as the Christ. Christ means, see, we've already lost somebody here. Christ, the anointed one. My understanding of that word anointed or the Christ means someone with a purpose, a purposeful mission. Okay? But we have used that word Christ as, I think, a way to say that Jesus was divine. So when we say Jesus the Christ, I think we think in terms of Jesus as being the divine one. That makes, this is something to flag for maybe discussions later on down the road. But I will share with you a concern I have about our language of the Christ. My concern as Christians in the 21st century, we're in a radically pluralist, religiously pluralistic world, a really complex world. If we talk about the importance of the Christ, my fear is, my discomfort is that it smacks of a kind of imperialism. We've done a lot of things in the name of Christ and to the glory of God. We've shed a lot of blood on that. We all know that. All the traditions have. As we know, religion is the great legitimator of an agenda, of a political or even personal agenda or excuse. Religion is the great legitimator. Okay. It also functions, as I said earlier, in many other ways that I think are actually more positive. To use the language of the Christ, I need help to think this through, because I'm concerned that it makes Jesus the ultimate criteria. I am saying that he shows us our capacity as human beings. But I'm a little nervous about Christ language because it has a way of claiming Christianity as being the ultimate. And for me, Christianity might be the ultimate. I'm a Christian. It's my path. That's my love song. But not for a minute am I going to suggest that if someone is Buddhist or Sufi or Hindi, that they don't sing their love song with as much passion as I sing mine. Okay, to use another analogy, I think my husband was the most adorable, gorgeous, brilliant man that ever was, aside from maybe Jesus. I mean, I get them confused all the time. So I can say that with superlatives, my beloved Marcus. That doesn't for a minute mean that somebody else says, but my beloved. My beloved. Let me tell you about my beloved. Okay? You get my point. So we can sing our love songs to Jesus and our love songs of Christianity boldly. But I think it's really important that we be thoughtful, that we not claim a kind of supremacy over other traditions or other understandings. And I think in this day and age, that's actually almost dangerous. So because of the Christ language, it just makes me a little nervous because it just, to me, smacks of a kind of an imperial stance. And I'm uncomfortable with it. Let me also say, there are some who suggest that Christ is an archetype. An archetype. that it's a symbol of the ultimate human being. I think Teilhard de Chardin kind of goes in that direction. And I think there are conversations about Christ as being like what I'm saying about Jesus, the human capacity. But because of Christ, Christianity, all of that, I just think it's problematic. Okay. So I just wanted to mention that. Okay. Moving right along, let me say a little bit about God. God is a word symbol. That may sound a little abstract or elitist, but God, the name God, is a word symbol. And there are many people for whom the name God or saying God is very problematic because of its association with gender and male and personification. And there are some people, Michael Morwood is one of those, who said, I don't even think we can use the word God anymore. Or sometimes the word God is in print, but it's G, space D, or it's unutterable, like the name Yahweh used to be, in the Hebrew tradition. It's like God, it's such a holy, in a sense, unnameable thing. You can't even name it. Okay. I understand, I think that for some of us, God language now is becoming increasingly problematic, but because of its powerful word, as a word symbol, because of its power throughout human history, I think it's going to be hard to relinquish the name God. I think the name God is going to be operative for a long time to come. I think the challenge for us, or the invitation for us, is to reimagine, what do we think we mean by God? When we talk about God, what are we talking about? What are we talking about? As you all know, the God of supernatural theism, this God of supernatural theism was the God up there, out there, somewhere, omniscient, knows if you've been bad or good. Androcentric, anthropomorphic, a being up there, out there, intervenes sometimes not. That God of supernatural theism has been also closely identified with the Christian God. And let me remind us all that some of these images of God are, needless to say, human projections based on what we know and what we don't know. So in an ancient universe, 3-story universe with, a heaven up there and a world here and maybe an underworld and many gods and the projection of the human persona on just about everything, it's understandable how you could come up with this God of supernatural theism. This is part of our historical development. But that God, a God up there, out there, who's a male most likely, sits on a throne, all that kind of business, knows if you've been bad or good, intervenes sometimes doesn't, is the judge, whatever. Does this sound familiar to you? You know what God I'm talking about here? Okay. Here's a shocking thing. I will suggest that God never was. That God never was. That doesn't mean it hasn't been part of our imagination and part of our even constructs of belief. When the new atheists take these crack shots at Christianity and talking about, how images of God and how, in a sense, immature Christianity is because of images of God, they're talking about the God of supernatural theism. It's a cheap shot, in my opinion, to talk about that is what we all mean by God, is the supernatural, anthropomorphic, androcentric being up there. In a pastoral setting, I would not speak quite this bluntly, because I'm also very sensitive to the fact that people have their own beliefs and that God functions in many, many, many different ways. Some of you who know me, I have talked to you about my relationship with Jesus I had a sense of Jesus from the time I was a little girl, and I was not churched, incidentally. But some of you who know me have heard me say, it's the same Jesus for me now, only entirely different. Okay. I also see Jesus in many ways for me as a child growing up. He was an attachment figure. I didn't even know about attachment figures growing up. I didn't know about any of that until I was in my 30s maybe. But I think he functioned as an attachment figure. I think God can function that way for us too. It's a presence of beingness and understanding, a hope, a construct, an experience, a relational encounter of some kind that helps us live. And that's very real. So I don't want to be too cheeky about saying the God of supernatural theism never existed. It never was. I don't think it ever was. But I want to be thoughtful about how God functions for us and to handle that with a little bit more tenderness. Does that make any sense? Okay. But I don't think that should keep us from being curious about our own tendency to project our own human construction on God. We can't help it. We just do it. But I think that how we imagine God today is a really important issue for us to think about. And especially, and I'll mention this at the very end, especially because I think one of the great things about our humanity is that we have agency. And if we relinquish our agency to God and God alone, I think we're done. Okay. Okie doke. So God, even though I don't think God is totally a human construction, there's a lot about God that is a human construction. And that's not a negative. It's just, in my opinion, that's a given. I just think that needs to be part of our awareness. It just needs to be part of our awareness. Okay. A little bit about mysticism. I suggest that we do not experience the mystical beyond the physical world. That we do not experience the mystical beyond the physical world. In other words, it's not metaphysical. Mysticism is not metaphysical, beyond the physical. Let me say that when I was in my 20s, I was absolutely fascinated by metaphysics. I loved all this esoteric stuff. I thought it was fascinating. And, the older I get, the less interested I am in any of that. Okay? I think that mystical experiences, not unlike religion, it's instinctive, it's part of human experience, and we all have the capacity for having quote-unquote mystical experiences. I'm all for the democratization of mysticism. Forget this esoteric business, that it's only for a few of us. I don't think it's true. I think we all have a sense, have had experiences of what William James might call the more. Okay? I think mysticism, mystical experiences are beyond the command of the ego. And in that I say, we don't make them up. They're beyond the command of the ego. They affect us affectively, but that doesn't mean it's just about emotion. I think that we all have, Thomas Merton says wonderful things about mystical experience. I mean, he basically says there's something shining through all of this all of the time. It's everywhere. It's within us. It's beyond us. It's around us. It's everywhere. The only trouble is we don't see it. He talks about, my friend David Depew sent me this wonderful description of Merton standing on 4th and Walnut, where he saw this radiance and this beauty and this wonder of existence. He really saw it in everyone. And he said, I guess you can't tell people that they have this shining through them, but they do. And this he saw when he was standing on 4th and Walnut. I suggest we all have experiences like that. Some of us call them thin places, or some of us where it's just, we're caught by the wonder of our existence, or by a moment of beauty, or that we make up a lot of this, but the wonder of existence is really phenomenal. Okay? And I think that mysticism is a really important, that sense of awe and wonder is really important for us to claim and cultivate and return to and not dismiss, because I think that's going to save us. Okay? So I wanted to make a comment about mysticism because I think that to separate mysticism from embodied experience, to separate that, and to split the divine and the created experience is a mistake. Just like with Jesus, splitting his divinity and his humanity. Making that split between the divine and the human, I think it's perilous. I'm not denying that there isn't more beyond us by a long shot. But I'm very nervous about making the distinction between, Richard Rohr talks about dualism all the time. So basically I'm talking about dualism. I think we need to be careful about making things dualistic. This is of God, this isn't. This is human experience, this is mystical. This is Jesus the Christ, this is Jesus, this is, if he weren't the Christ, it isn't Jesus. All of that stuff I think we need to take a look at. I think that all needs to be part of the conversation. Let me say something related to mysticism, and this has to do with language. We all push against the limits of our language. Language has its limits. And we thrust against the limits of language all the time. That's also part of the beauty and wonder of human beings. It was Wittgenstein who suggested that very thrust against the limits of language, okay, and I think that's a deep human instinct also, that very thrust towards the limits of language, and that can be in different, poetry, prose, art, music, whatever, the limits of language. That very thrust points toward something. I think he's right. And he suggests, and I love this phrase, that when the inexpressible expresses itself, that is the mystical. That catches my heart and it catches my imagination. When the inexpressible expresses itself, that is the mystical. And I think if we gave ourselves some time to wonder about our own mystical experiences that are beyond language, but that point to something, I don't think there's not a person in this room who on some level doesn't know what I'm talking about. Okay. So let me just see if let me go here. So I'm going to make some sort of concluding comments. I made a case for religion. I think that religion is an important human endeavor, and it has a very important human function. As I said when we started out, we are at a time when we need to take responsibility for what we believe and why we believe it. We need to look at a lot of that anew. The Bible is a human product. Jesus shows us our capacity as human beings. I think that is his great, that's our hope, in my opinion. I mentioned to you that I'm a little nervous about Christ language, especially in this 21st century. God is a word symbol, granted a human construction, but God is beyond human construction as well. It's sort of the inexpressible expressing itself. I'm suggesting that as Christians in the 21st century, that we must not disembody the divine or the sacred from ourselves or creation. That we must not disembody the sacred or the divine from ourselves or from creation. And that as we talk about our faith and our belief and our wonderments, yes, there is limit to language, but let us press ahead anyway. So as we move ahead in conversation, in exploration about what we believe, what we think is possible, what we think is real, what we think is at stake, I think it's really essential that we preserve a sense of mystery, awe, and wonder. And that we exist at all. As I said, if we lose sight of that, that is, along with Jesus showing us our capacity, I think that mystery, awe, and wonder is our hope, our sense of that. I think as Christians in the 21st century, I suggest that we need to move beyond doctrine and dogma. There is a place for it. It has a function. I think my good friend Bill is going to say a little something about that. I'm not saying throw it out, but I'm suggesting that there's a lot about doctrine and dogma that's its own closed system. It's fine if we want to return to a lot of that stuff, but if we want to make an appeal for why being Christian or why being religious or why being a human being is so important, I think we need to get away from doctrine and dogma. Okay, let me also say where I come out on all of this stuff. I'm seeking a more humane humanity and a more humane Christianity. I think we have to have a more humane Christianity. I also suggest, as part of our ongoing conversations, that we need to broaden our religious curiosity. Christianity does not have a corner on the market. It's not that we have and my good friend Bill may disagree with me here a bit, we don't have necessarily the best view. We certainly don't have the only view. And I think that since religions are indeed human constructions, they're cross-cultural, they're pluralistic, they're religious, cultural, linguistic storytelling. All religions give us a view, a lens into what we think of world and human beings and mortality. We can learn from one another. And I think that it's really important that we broaden our religious curiosity and make sure that we appreciate what we can learn from one another through other lenses. I think it's essential that as we move forward, that we be scientifically and intellectually honest about our faith. And I think science is an essential, if not very advantageous partner in our conversations about reality, about God, about what is real, about what is possible. So science, there was a time of neo-orthodoxy where they said the language of science and the language of religion, they're two different things, so we can't really talk to each other. We have to talk to each other. So scientific and intellectual honesty is essential as we redefine, reconstruct, reimagine our faith. One little note about Revelation. Revelation, and that's a whole other topic, but it's an ongoing process. It's not static. It didn't come from on high. It's not allotted. It's evolutionary. Revelation is evolutionary. And I want to make a case for beauty. I think Augustine was right when he said we cannot live without beauty. And we can unpack what do we mean by beauty. I return to a word, the word poesis, which is where we get the word for poetry. It means to bring something into being that didn't exist before. Poesis means to make, or to change, or to transform. And I think that we as human beings have this remarkable capacity of poesis, of being able to make and create and transform. We're world-making, meaning-making creatures. We have imagination and we have agency. And I think it's really important that we, as we think about what it means to be people of faith and people of community, that we underscore the importance of our imagination and our agency. And that indeed, God is that within which we live and move and have our being. That's from our own scriptures. God is with us. We participate in God. God participates in us. But I suggest that changing how we behave and taking care of one another in the world, I suggest that's up to us. It's up to us. And that we have a responsibility for our planet and for our human future. And that as religious people, that has to be understood, and we have to take responsibility for our futures. I'm going to end with this by offering you a definition of God by Gordon Kaufman. I love this. Gordon Kaufman suggests that God is serendipitous creativity. I love that as a phrase. Serendipitous creativity. That we're not in control of everything. We can't imagine. We have our limits of imagination as well as having fabulous imagination. But there is this something that happens that I love Kaufman's description of serendipitous creativity that seems to meet us in our relationships, in happenstances, in awe and wonder, that suggests that, Martin Luther King said that the arc of the universe bends towards justice. I think that the physicists will say that there's something about the nature of reality that bends more towards matter than antimatter. The little neutrino, the subatomic superhero of the subatomic world, neutrinos, we've got billions of them inside of us. They tend toward matter rather than antimatter. And that's probably technical language that I really don't know what it means, but I love how it sounds. Serendipitous creativity. I think that amidst all of this stuff that is difficult, that there is also something wondrous that moves towards multiplicity, creativity, sustainability, and we're part of that. And I think that the question is being called on how we are going to take our part in the family of things and help to secure a human future, a future for God, a future for our planet. And it's up to us. Okay.
Well, first of all, thank you very, very much for that. That was really quite wonderful. What you'll discover as we go along is that I think, with one exception, probably I'm a bit more traditional in my views, not wildly more traditional, but somewhat.
Well, if you're going to be traditional, be wildly traditional.
Yeah. Let me start by saying, by focusing on something that Marianne introduced but didn't spend a lot of time on, that is, progressive Christianity is not one thing. That's absolutely correct. Christianity in general has never been one thing. Never, ever, ever. There have been numerous attempts through history to make Christianity one thing. In other words, to turn it into a monoculture instead of, a tree farm instead of a forest. That's never actually worked. And so when Marianne says progressive Christianity is not one thing, she's not only absolutely right, what she's doing is talking about Christianity in general. It has never been one thing, and I hope it never is. The attempt to enforce uniformity of thought or uniformity of action has always failed, and it will always fail. And I think it's terribly important for us to start with that. So let me talk about religion and agree. Religion is also, it is a human construct. There's no question about it. But the only thing I would add to what Marianne says is it's a religious construct that is a response to something. And by thing, I don't necessarily mean an entity. It's a response to that mystery. It's a response to that which is completely inexpressible. It's a response to that which we not only don't know now, but we can't quite know. But it's a response to an awareness that there is more to this than we can deal with with our five senses. Religion always starts as response. And let me give you one quick example of that. The ancient Egyptians, I have no doubt in my mind, and it's partly because I didn't make this up, the ancient Egyptians did not start saying, there must be a river god, and then notice the river rose each year. The ancient Egyptians noticed the river rose, the Nile rose, and said, there must be a river god who brings fertile soil and cares about us and provides us an opportunity to plant new crops every single year with soil that's replenished. They looked, in other words, at the world that they saw. And they responded to it by saying, there's something else going on. And that is how religion has always been. A response to that something else, which ultimately becomes inexpressible. We just know it. And we know it because of what we can see in the world and how we can think about it. And we know it as well because of just some inner sense of ourselves, which most of us, inner experience in our own souls, which is mystical on the one hand, but ineffable in other ways, and yet somehow tangible. I think every religion has been started that way, and every religion is sustained by that character of response. Same thing with the Bible, from my point of view. The Bible is indeed a human product. There's no question about that. And indeed, the Bible was written for a different audience than this one. There's also, in my mind, no question about that. But the Bible also is written as response. It is inspired by the desire to respond to this ineffable whatever, this this unpronounceable, unknowable which takes us beyond ourselves. And therefore, the Bible, which is not, I believe we know this, is not a single book like the Koran or anything of that sort. The Bible is actually 66 books, if we count the appendix that we call the New Testament. The Bible is actually 66 different books, some of which, let me say, are extremely agnostic, if not atheistic, about the God of what did you call it, theological? Supernatural theism. I do not know how you can read the book of Ecclesiastes. I do not know how you can read the book of Job. I do not know how you can read big hunks of Isaiah or any of the prophets. I do not know how you can read those books and not say, these people did not believe in the God of supernatural theism. Others, of course, do. Other people in Scripture do believe in the God of supernatural theism. But there are many examples in the Bible because it's because of its character as response, who completely reject the notion of supernatural theism. I've got to say that enough times that I actually remember the term. And that's something for us to realize too. The Bible its character is as of a response. Furthermore, there is a tremendous argument going on throughout Scripture, from my point of view, from the start to the finish. And that argument as near as I can tell, goes something like this. On the one hand, there is that group of people, group of biblical authors, part of the culture that says, because we are guided by God, we can build the world of our dreams. That's one theory that animates some of the biblical authors. There is another theory animating the biblical authors as well. And it is this: no matter what we do, we cannot build the world of our dreams. We have been trying forever, and we have failed every single time. The prophetic critique, and that's what it is. It's some of the most courageous literature in all of the history of the world, says, you tried to be faithful, you tried to build the world of your dreams, and what did you do? You goofed up everything. And you do not deserve to live in the presence of God. And yet, and in very anthropomorphic terms, describes God's irritation with all of us. But with that, again, from start to finish, with this critique, from start to finish, the same thing happens every single time. The Bible is absolutely clear. Those who believe we cannot build the world of our dreams is absolutely clear that the wrath of God is always overcome by the mercy of God. That happens every single time. From Cain killing Abel to Malachi, the wrath of God is always overcome by the mercy of God. And that is a theme that runs clear through the entire story. And I happen to believe that's the story that is true. And therefore I believe this. I disagree with one group of biblical authors who believe that religion is a prescription for human behavior and thought. And agree with that group of biblical authors who argue that religion, that religion is a description, and Scripture is a description of the human dilemma. That is how I read the Bible, and that's how I read the whole historic Judeo-Christian tradition. Not as a prescription for behavior, but as a description of the human dilemma. We want to create the world of our dreams, and we can't do it. So when you say to me, as a progressive Christian, do you believe in the Bible? I say, which part? I completely disagree with a big hunk of Scripture. I think it's wrong. And I completely agree with another big hunk of Scripture. I think it's right. I think it understands me. So when we talk about the Bible, we are talking about 66 different books written for another people in another time, but which speak directly to us, as I think Marianne so accurately said, because it describes the human dilemma and our ceaseless inability to build the world of our dreams, and yet, it speaks of that ineffable, whatever it is, that will not let us go. That will not go away and say, I guess you're on your own after all. So that's enough about the Bible. Let me think about Jesus for a minute. This is where Marianne and I see Marianne as a bit more conservative than I in this one regard. I know, lots of you know a lot about Jesus. I know nothing about Jesus. I read the Gospels, and what I see in the Gospels is not a biography of Jesus, not even remotely. I see the way in which Jesus was interpreted by the Jews who loved him most and followed him longest. That's what I see. And I see, in addition to the Gospels, some other writings, the most brilliant of which I believe come from a fellow that we identify as Paul, because he identified himself that way ultimately. It's an interpretation of Jesus. And it's rooted in a central miracle, which is what gets me to be less concerned about language like the Christ and so forth. And the central miracle is this. After the death of Jesus, the people who loved him most and followed him longest went to the people who killed him, and they went to the people who collaborated in that killing him, and they said, "You are loved. You are accepted. You are part of the kingdom. You are part of the realm or the reign or whatever you want to call it. You are part of the arena in which there's an openness and a capacious attitude towards you. You are, to use shorthand, you are loved and you are accepted." How many times has that happened in the history of the world? When your hero is murdered for a crime he did not commit, and you go to the people who killed him and said, "You are loved." Normally when your leader is killed, you do one of two things. If you are too weak, you run away and hide. If you are strong enough, you fight back. And maybe you're destroyed and maybe you're not. Maybe you win. But nowhere have I ever heard of this. And that to me, again, is the central miracle of the death of Jesus. The central miracle. And to me, that is why I don't have much trouble with the language of Christ, although I agree completely with Marianne that Jesus has been interpreted as a justification for, I think the term you used, it was imperialism. It absolutely has. For centuries, Jesus has been used as a justification for a kind of spiritual imperialism that attempts to impose a monoculture on the world, and fails, fortunately. But in fact, what is being said, if I have analyzed the central miracle correctly, what is being said is, it does not matter what your religion is. Because of what God did in this person, everybody is part of the divine plan. Everybody is part of what it means to be included in the whole realm of humanity. Everybody is. And that was the central truth that they spoke to their Jewish brothers and sisters. Which is why, ultimately, their Jewish brothers and sisters said, "This isn't just weird Judaism. This isn't Judaism at all." And finally said, "You don't get to come here if you're not going to obey the law of Moses. You don't get to do that." Their problem was not claiming Jesus was the Messiah. Their problem was, from the point of view of the synagogue, is they weren't being Jewish anymore. They weren't following the law. And they were telling people, you can come and be part of this organization without following the law. And they said, "No, you can't. You just can't do that. That's cheating." And so, ultimately, Christianity and Judaism go two separate ways. And Christianity becomes another religion, among others, rather than the perspective that says, because of who God is, because of the way the whole universe is organized, all of your attempts to build up walls, all of your attempts to define who's in and who's out, all of your attempts to say who's good and who's bad, all of your attempts are wrong. What that leads to is violence and death. What that leads to is a world of domination, the world of Caesar. And we have a different vision. And guess what? We couldn't pull it off. We goofed it too. Christians goofed it in precisely the way that Marianne talks about, which is why I consider myself to be in that very broad realm of progressive Christianity today. Because what I see is the complete vindication of the biblical description of the human dilemma, which is that we receive an inspiration unlike most other inspirations. And we have no idea what to do with it. We turn it into a recipe. We turn it into a prescription for thought and behavior, because that's what people do. So, what I want to do is preserve both Scripture and Jesus as a critique of the human condition. A critique that says, no matter that wrath will always be overcome by mercy. And that is what, and moreover, I want to preserve it as a critique that comes to us from that ineffable, inexplicable from God. And that's why I have no trouble cherishing the divinity of Jesus along with his humanity. Because I want to preserve the notion that that critique is true. And the reason it's true is it comes to us from whatever that realm is that suffuses and infuses and is deeply saturating this entire world, as well as being completely beyond it. So this is what keeps me a traditional kind of Trinitarian, and that's where I really kind of want to end. Is with just a brief word about the purpose of doctrine. Doctrine over the past 1600 years has been used, I think, in much the way, in fact, I'm quite convinced in much the way Marianne has described it, as a way of trying to create a monoculture. And in fact, what was the Reformation? I mean, this is a ridiculous caricature of it. But the Reformation was an attempt to say to the Pope, your monoculture is wrong, our monoculture is right. Oh, come on. Is this the best we can do? And the answer turns out to be, yeah, that's about the best we can do. Sorry, God, that's about the best we can do. So doctrine has been used in really horrible ways for a long, long period of time. And it's been used in horrible ways, not just by Roman Catholics, and not just by Lutherans, and not just by the various Calvinist religions. It's been used by everybody. I mean, think of what the Marxists did to Marx when they turned him into a doctrine and called it communism. Then Marx used the term too. It got so bad that even during Marx's lifetime, Marx said, I am not a Marxist. It got that bad. In the same way, I think, Jesus would have said, I am not a Christian, forget it. No way. But communism is a religion. Capitalism is a religion. Freudianism for a long time was used as a religion because it was a way of explaining the human situation and building the world of our dreams. That's not true of Freud, who was kind of pessimistic and said, the best you can do is cope. And eventually you die and it all works out then. Again, a ridiculous caricature of Freud, and I apologize to everybody who's actually studied psychology and psychiatry. But my caricature is intended to point at something, that we take all of these different things and turn them into orthodoxies and try to make monocultures out of them. That was not what doctrine was all about, ever, in the beginning. Doctrine was about two things. One, it was about saying a little bit about who we're not. We are not people who believe that God hates us. In fact, we are about people who believe that God loves us. That is not an empirically demonstrable fact, folks. That's a doctrine. Doctrine was about saying, indeed, that in Jesus we were met by that indescribable We don't know that. That is not an empirically demonstrable fact. That is a doctrine. It absolutely is. In other words, doctrine was designed initially to try to explain our experience to ourselves, whether it be the doctrine of the Trinity or the doctrine of original sin or whatever doctrine you might like. Ultimately, it was turned into a way of enforcing a monoculture. And that process happened pretty quickly. But not in the beginning. And as a progressive Christian, what I want to do is say, let's bag the admittedly ancient use of doctrine and get back to what doctrine was designed to do. to explain our own experience and to help us understand who we really are. Which again is why I'm fine. In fact, I think the doctrine of the Trinity, although we need different language to talk about it today. I don't usually use the term hypostasis very often. I can't remember. I know, it's really kind of neat, but I can't remember the last time I really used it in a casual context. Maybe there was a cocktail party or something. Can't remember. But we need to use language about the Trinity that reflects our actual current usage and understanding of and so forth. But I'm okay with doctrine. In fact, I think doctrine is important for those two reasons. Tells us what we're not. We're not people who believe God's a hater. And it's our way of describing our experience to us. Well, I think that's about enough, because I could say one more word just about language and say I disagree with you completely. That language is always problematical. Which is why people like Martin Luther, who essentially invented modern German in his translation of Scripture, and St. Paul, had to stretch the bounds of language so completely that they practically reinvented it. St. Paul was a Pharisaical Christian, a Pharisaical Jew, who did everything right. You read, and if you don't believe me, talk to him. In Philippians, he writes to the Philippians, he says, I was a perfect Jew. Paul had no trouble at all obeying all of the commands that are printed out in the first 5 books of the Bible. No trouble at all. He knew he was a perfect Jew. And what he discovered in light of Jesus was that none of that mattered. He got blown away by the fact, wow, all my being a perfect Jew does is get me to feel good about myself. It does not create a relationship with God. I can't do that by myself. So this idea that Paul said, I know I'm not supposed to eat the cookies before dinner because it'll spoil my appetite, but I take them anyway and then I get in trouble. Paul never ate the cookies. Never once. And he discovered all that did was make him smug and self-righteous. And that got blown out of him. How do you talk about that? How do you talk about the fact that the whole law, which he believed was holy and just and good, he says that has just been stood on its head and demonstrated to him the opposite of what he thought it did? How do you talk about that? Paul had to invent a whole new language. And he invented it in a way that was almost instantly misunderstood by other writers of the Bible. James never got it. And he wrote this epistle saying, show me your faith. I'll show you my faith by my works. And it had nothing to do with what Paul was talking about. So anyway, language is elusive. Language is problematical. Language is also all we've got. And we are at the liminal edges of human experience, ceaselessly having to invent new language to describe brand new experiences. So I think that's enough for right now. Yeah.
Let me suggest how we'll do conversations for this last part of our gathering. I'm going to read some, they're called Discernment Listening Guidelines. It's from Listening Hearts Ministries. And many of you may be familiar with this, but there are 10 guidelines for listening and conversation in groups. So I'm going to read these 10 suggested guidelines. And let me preface this by saying I think these are really, really hard to maintain. And people who have seen me in other group settings know that I break these rules all the time. But I'm going to encourage us in our conversation today, and as we continue down the months, that we apply these to the best of our ability. And I will read these listening guidelines before we have our general conversations. Okay? So I'm going to do that in just a moment. And then I'm going to give us about a minute of silence And what I invite you to do is just see what thoughts come up in response to what we talked about this morning. What struck you, or a puzzlement, or a curiosity, or something that you're uncomfortable with, or something that sparked an additional thought for you. Okay? I'm going to give you a minute so that you can have your own thought come to you. Then we'll spend about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. 10?
Please, yeah.
Okay. To have you just, what I'm going to invite after that is just for people to share your immediate response. You know, what came up for you. We'll give ourselves about 10, maybe 15 minutes to do that with no crosstalk. In other words, just have people share what struck them. And then you and I will kind of listen to see if there are some themes that emerge, or if it seems clear that, okay, for the rest of our time together, let's unpack this or let's address this. And then we'll have more conversation. Okay? So that's sort of the format that we'll use. Right? And then at about 20 after, 25 after, I'll bring our conversation to a close, and I'm going to offer a brief close for this session and remind us of the next one to come. So, okay, here are some listening guidelines. Take time to become settled in God's presence. Listen to others with your entire self. Senses, feelings, intuition, imagination, and rational faculties. Do not interrupt. Pause between speakers to absorb what has been said. Do not formulate what you want to say while someone else is speaking. Speak for yourself only, expressing your own thoughts and feelings, referring to your own experiences. Avoid being hypothetical and steer away from broad generalizations. Good luck to us, huh? Do not challenge what others say. Listen to the group as a whole, to those who have not spoken aloud as well as to those who have. Generally, leave space for anyone who may want to speak a first time before speaking a second time yourself. And hold your desires and opinions, even your convictions, lightly. Okay? We'll do our best to follow this.
Yeah.
Right? It slows it down a little bit, slows conversation down a little bit, but I think it also helps to create a kind of spaciousness and ultimately a kind of trust. Yeah. So let's give it a go.
Madeline Engel said something I thought was quite brilliant with respect to that last guideline.
Holding your convictions lightly?
She said, she was speaking at a general convention. She said, I reserve the right to disagree with myself at any moment. And I thought, that's something to live by. And it became one of my mottos.
Okay.
I reserve the right to disagree with me. Yeah.
I think we might add that as the 11th guideline. We'll add that for next time. Yeah. And it was Madeline Engel herself who said that the 11th commandment is consider the lilies of the field.
Yeah, there you go. Uh-huh. Yeah.
That would be ideal, to have a male voice and then a female. So to see if we can do a little gender balance, that would be great. Okay. Again, we won't have, as I call it, crosstalk. This is just an opportunity to share into the circle some things you observed, some things you'd like to say without dialogue at this point. Okay? And I'm going to keep my eye on the time, and I'll check in with us in about 10 minutes and see where we are. Okay? Who'd like to begin?
I liked the comment about Jesus shows us what we can be. It seems so much more straightforward than saying we follow Christ, which isn't as instructional as is showing us what we can be.
Well,
That's all right. That's all right.
First of all, thank you, guys. You're so inspiring and touching to listen to. And a couple things that struck me. One was the attachment figure. So that I don't remember the words, and I was going to try to remember, but this up in the sky dad thing that doesn't make sense to me anymore. But I work with kids, and I think about how do we give them that attachment figure that makes them know they're loved. And, you know, so that's really important to me. And then the thing about, I don't know, some things you said made me think of it. And one is that when we're afraid, we cling to certainty more, I feel like. And in these times that are so traumatizing for so many of us, just when you watch the news, and how do we, I think of, this is kind of random, but I was thinking, Bill, of how you talked about this is the one time in history where your leader was killed, and you can still go and say you are loved to the people who killed him. And I think people who can do that feel safe. They're not doing fight, flight, freeze. So how do we help people feel safe enough to love and deal with the uncertainties, accept uncertainties? Thank you.
Just try to provide a little silence, a little space between.
I'm thinking about your comment, Bill, about how we want to create the world of our dreams, but we can't. And I remember, I think this is right, that Paul Tillich asked that he have his ashes spread at the New Harmony community, basically saying, all these experiments will fail, but we keep at it. So if you have a comment later on about that, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you.
I was just struck by how big my voice is on this thing. I hate microphones, but I really wanted to express this, that I was struck within my heart by how in the process of acknowledging the limitations, the human limitations of the Bible, the doctrines of our faith, the business end, so to speak, of our faith, by acknowledging the human limitations of that, how it seems like an invitation for the possibility for faith to expand exponentially. So by limiting the one, it somehow provides the opportunity for the other to blossom.
Marianne, you mentioned religious curiosity. I'm wondering if there's a little bit of a contradiction. Curiosity in general seems to run smack against doctrine. And I'm not quite sure how religious curiosity can blend with doctrine if the curiosity implies the ability or the inclination to question. Where's this going, etc. Curiosity versus doctrine. I don't have that one figured out.
Some other comments. What struck you? What struck you? What puzzles you? What makes you wonder about?
I'll go with the word expand. When you were talking about the concept of Christ, if we could move towards expanding the concept of the Christ, Teilhard's Christic seems to me is both cosmic and personal, and offers a way forward in terms of language with that, just as part of the conversation.
Thank you all for all the good thoughts. I was thinking about what it must have been like when Christ or Jesus was telling everyone to do exactly what they had been told to do all their lives. These rules don't apply. These are the new rules. I don't know that he was actually telling people, he was demonstrating. And I was thinking how radical his views must have seemed to people at that time, and how they received it. It reminds me of how people today receive ideas that are radically different than what they think or how they perceive the world to be. And that was the parallel that sort of jumped out at me, because if we are thinking about how to be inclusive, how to listen to each other, it seems that some of what's going on today parallels what might have been going on when Jesus was telling people, give away everything you own. Hang out with the lepers and the prostitutes, which must have seemed really radical. So that was what popped up for me. Thank you.
Yeah, we got Bob there.
Yeah, I'm curious. Some of the comments that were said today have got me thinking about if we personally evolve to the point of accepting our lack of control over events and directions and so forth, and then if we also start to try to embrace the concept that we're going to fail, no matter what we try, where do we go from here?
That's a good question.
I was struck by what Marianne said about Augustine said that we cannot live without beauty. And I think that's where mystery is. C.S. Lewis talks about in Mere Christianity, early in Mere Christianity, about, an argument for God. It's like that deep feeling you get when you hear beautiful music or you see a beautiful flower. And I think that's where we experience the mystical is, we get this deep kind of a longing, almost sad feeling inside when we experience beauty. And I would say that's as much as a experience of God as we can get. And so, I think we all, focusing on seeing beauty is a way for us to then love, because everybody can see that, has an opportunity to see that beauty, but seeing that and then seeing beauty in the people we look at, regardless of their station in life. So I think that's a really important thing.
A few more.
If part of what we're seeking is to get beyond words and get to experience, I'm wondering how future editions of this group might offer opportunities for us to have an experience that we can try to share with others in our lives.
Thanks. So I have a question and an observation. And I want to thank you both and thank everybody for their comments as well. So Marianne, you used a lot of words that I'm going to have to go home and look up in the dictionary. But one word that you used several times that I'd like to hear more about is agency. And my observation is that one phrase that you used is sort of, I think, the nugget of what's been troubling me all along is the God who chooses to intervene sometimes and sometimes not.
The supernatural.
Thanks, Gail.
Well, thank you. It was an incredible blend of things I like to hear, the two of you. And in terms of that, and one of the things I liked hearing the most was serendipitous creativity as the name for God. And that was going to become my name for God. And that lined up with Bill's, we cannot create the world we have imagined. It gives me a lot of hope, because God is incredibly creative. So, the fact that me as a person trying to create that perfect world, it's not my job, and I don't have to worry so much about it.
Didn't work.
It came up that the word Christ is imperial.
Is a what?
Imperial.
Empirical.
Yet we call ourselves Christians. If that's too imperial, what should we call ourselves?
Yeah. Okay. Maybe one more, and then we'll...
The idea of mysticism as an embodied experience is blowing my mind right now.
Okay. Let's just sit with this for just a moment and honor what we've heard and sit with what we've heard. And then in the about 10 minutes or so we have left. Is that about right? 10, 15?
15, maybe.
We'll continue to explore the conversation. So, my friend and colleague, how should we go about this?
Well, that's a good question that we perhaps might have answered prior to this moment. In terms of themes, you suggested that we think about some themes, and certainly one theme that emerged from me in terms of this whole thing, actually it started with your thought about if we acknowledge our limitations, it can actually be freeing. And Bob's thought about, well, if we know we're going to fail, then what's the point? I mean, how do we keep trying? I actually see those two ideas almost as two sides of the same coin. And then there were some other comments that I thought fit into that with respect to how do we follow, if you will, how do we be Christian, if that's even the term that we want, in this world right now? I see that as kind of a practical question. Is what's the sense in which we are free? What's the sense in which, and the question about doctrine too. I forget who or the comment about curiosity and doctrine. I see also that fitting in, and I could talk about that for a moment, but I also want to know if you heard other themes or other thoughts emerge for you as well.
Yeah. One thing that a thought that comes up for me is, for those of us who might consider ourselves Christian in this group, I mean, what does it mean to be Christian? What does it mean to be Christian? And if we have agency, if there are things that, we have a capacity to act and to make a difference and to make we're world-making creatures. as Christians, what is that? But I mentioned early in the day that where I'm tipping my hat is I'm really seeking a more humane humanity.
Right.
And I'm seeking a more humane Christianity. Okay? And I know that humanism gets sort of a bad rap, and actually I've never understood that. I don't know what the problem is with humanism. But there is, with the concern about our limits and that maybe we'll never quite fulfill and all that kind of stuff. I hear that's true, and I'm puzzling with you. As the Dalai Lama says, never give up.
Right.
Never give up. But I think that we also have to recognize, and this is going to sound a little, language is not very good here, but we're all part of a process. I mean, this is a dynamic. We're living beings, and we're, in terms of looking ahead to a human future. Yes, we're going to die. We have our limits. There's only so much we're going to be able to accomplish in our lifetime. But do we have a view that looks towards a human future and that continues to hope for a human future, for human endeavor, for human creativity, as well as creaturely, as well as life on this planet? And my hope is that Christianity, whatever we think it is and whatever it is continuing to become, because it's not a static thing, that it addresses our human future and helps us to want to invest in a human and creaturely future, and that helps us to want to love this planet for futures who can experience this. And I sometimes, I think we're long past the stage where Christianity is about getting into heaven. Okay? And maybe we're not that far from thinking that Christianity is about getting into heaven. But I remember my beloved husband saying that as a kid growing up, he thought, if it isn't about getting into heaven, what is it about?
Why bother? Yeah.
What is it? I mean, what are we doing any of this for? I think that's a really important question. And so, for me, just a number of puzzlements here about, everything from agency to beauty to how do we talk to our children in such a way that we say, as my mother would have said, the game is worth the candle. Or that even though things go bump in the night, that there is some deep abiding something about our life and our existence that is trustworthy. Do we believe that? For all of human foibles, because we're capable of heinous things and we're capable of absolutely remarkable things. But on some deep existential level, do we think we're trustworthy? Because if we don't, I don't think we're going to make it. And I'm not talking about rose-colored glasses here, but I'm saying what do we really think of humanity? Who do we think we are? What do we think we're capable of? What do we think is possible? Maybe we'll never quite have that, the golden city, maybe that'll never quite happen. But how does that affect our motivation, our hopefulness, our agency, our engagement? I mean, how are we doing this? Knowing full well that mortality is a reality for all of us. And I'm not denying something after, I simply don't know. But this is our opportunity. And I hope that Christianity and all the great religious traditions speak to that. Because I think what we have here is remarkable and it matters. And I hope there are future generations who can experience it and take it the next level, whatever that's going to be. I think that's exciting. I'm not saying humanity is the top of the heap. I don't know that. But I think that humanity is remarkable. Right up there with my dog.
Right. Well, unless you're a fan of Douglas Adams, in which case the mice are the top of the heap and the dolphins. We are the top of this particular heap.
I mean, that doesn't address directly, but I'm stirring the pot.
And I just want to, at this point, pick up on those couple of things. First of all, Reinhold Niebuhr, who is my great spiritual hero, once said, among many other things, that nothing that is truly worth doing can be accomplished in a single lifetime, and therefore we are saved by hope. And that's something I've also carried with me. But I want to start with your comment about limitation and so forth. It is precisely that notion of the sense of limitation that to me is absolutely freeing, because it forces me to abandon my complete faith in myself. It forces me to quit believing that I actually have the solution, and therefore is absolutely freeing in that it creates for me an opportunity to learn from everybody here as well as from the universe, which I find to be completely accepting of me, regardless of what I do. Isn't that weird? There's nothing I can do to keep the universe from continuing to send me, as Jesus said, air and water. Now, ultimately, of course, collectively we can do that with this planet, but not ultimately to the universe. So I find it to be extremely freeing, which is where I get into this business of curiosity and doctrine not being at a clash, but actually working together. Doctrine, in the way that it has been used for 1,500 years, absolutely opposes curiosity. We have been curious enough, Ken, thank you, and we have resolved everything there is to be curious about. So just shut up and listen. Now that is one way of using doctrine. And you're absolutely correct. That sense of doctrine is totally opposed to curiosity, because the curiosity has already been taken care of by experts, thank you. But at the heart of doctrine is curiosity. How do we make sense of our own experience of this world, this one world we have, this one experience we've had? How do we do that? And so I think because it is absolutely a dynamism in the process of life, that curiosity is indispensable to the development of doctrine, because our understanding of who we are, where we've come from, where we're going, is in fact a dynamic process. So I agree with you completely with respect to the notion of the way doctrine's been used. I think doctrine has been misused in that regard, which gets me to Bob's notion about, okay, how do we keep going? And the way I say we keep going, and it gets to my definition of what a Christian is. As a Christian, I accept, for me, the definition of Christianity is I accept the critique of Scripture about me and humanity in general. I believe that critique was fully embodied, fully incarnated, if you want to use traditional Christian language, in what happened to Jesus, who comes to us as the mediator of the truth about humanity. And we responded that, in other words, the mediator of God, to use, again, that somewhat problematical word, the mediator of God to us. And what did we do? We once again said, this isn't just a weird God or a bad God. This isn't God at all. And we killed him, vindicating the critique perfectly. Absolutely vindicating that critique. So I accept, to me, being a Christian is I accept a critique because I accept and believe what happened to Jesus proved and vindicated it, and that was from God. That was from whatever that ineffable is, both out there and in here. That's why I'm a Christian, because I believe what happened to Jesus reveals the complete and whole truth about us. And the whole truth about God is that even when you kill God, even when you kill him, God will not go away. God will not give up. God will not abandon. Wrath is always overcome by mercy. And that's why I can keep going. That's why I keep going. Yes, I will fail. Yes, I will kill God at every opportunity, because God just doesn't do a very good job of being God. Precisely because all kinds of bad things happen. He's just crappy at it. And I know. So I'll constantly kill God. But I will constantly be exposed to the fact that I have done that. Constantly. And I will keep going. My biblical image is the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. If you catch up with it, you don't know where to go next. If it is always ahead of you, then you can follow. So no, you don't get there. But it shows you the path. And the path is towards a more humane humanity, a more humane Christianity, a more humane spirituality, an ever more expansive way of understanding who we are in this together. Rather than, in other words, as we hear in Ephesians and other places, a breaking down rather than building up of walls. So it's what Christianity means to me. It's why I can keep going. It's why I believe so much that the acknowledgement of my limitation and finitude is the frame thing, from my point of view. And I think also it speaks a bit to the notion of agency in that, yes, we are all we've got in a very real sense. But without that pillar of fire by night, by day, pillar of fire by night, pillar of cloud by day, we don't know where to go. We have no idea where to go. And so we'll make something up. We'll just make it up. And we'll say, God is a hater. God's a wall builder. God's not a creator. God's a destroyer. God's a vindicator of a particularly narrow point of view. All of which we claim about God. And I say that is not following the pillar of fire by night or the pillar of cloud by day. That's going somewhere else. So we use our agency. We can use our ability to choose and to act. We can use it in a way that is idolatrous. Or we can use it in a way that surrenders our whole way of understanding who we are to whatever that is out in front of us. And go that route. So that's the way I kind of try to tie a lot of these thoughts together. But I agree with Marianne completely, and probably with other people, that Christianity is not primarily about what happens after you die. In fact, I'm not sure that it really is at all about what happens after you die. I believe Christianity is about how we deal with this one life that we've got right here, and how we live it out, and then the rest just has to take care of itself. And I trust that it will.
Okay, I want to make one comment about the God that we keep killing. It's our projection and our construction. So if we assign God certain things and then say, God didn't come through for me, I just want us to be mindful of the fact that it's because we can't answer that question. And we project what we think God, is, or God doesn't intervene. Okay? What do we mean when we say God doesn't intervene? Is it because my husband died at 72 from lung cancer and somebody else got to live for another 10 years? Did God not intervene? Okay? God was right there, whatever God is, okay? But these are things we, as to borrow from you, make up. This is our way of trying to create a narrative to try to explain what we cannot know, but what we have to live in and with, and hopefully for. So I just want us to be mindful and responsible of how much of what we say is religion is our own construction. And that's no fault, no blame there, but it's just the reality.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no.
No fault, no blame. We're coming close to end of time. I want one question. The gentleman who said about sharing experience, can you say just a little bit more about what you meant by that? about when you said that maybe in further groups we can, some way about sharing experience. Can you just cue me a little bit about what you're getting at? And then I'm going to do a close for today.
Well, I'm hoping that what I would take from coming back repeatedly is some kind of experience that gives me a glimpse of that sense of wonder, because I think that's what we have to share with people.
Great, good. I thank you for that. You might have noticed that we didn't do small groups today. We puzzled about that.
I was very anti-small group.
Yes, and I see some thumbs up about that. It's like, but there are ways I'm sure that we can share our experiences even without necessarily doing small groups. So we'll work on that.
It didn't come to fisticuffs or anything.
Yeah, no. You were very gracious about it. But anyway, let me remind us that our next session, we meet on the 2nd. The invitation is for the 2nd Saturday of the month. Next month, it'll be December 8. That's the 2nd Saturday, December 8. It'll be from 9 until 11:30 here. We would still appreciate it if you want to RSVP on the website, because that way we can plan for beverages and so forth. Please feel free to bring a friend if you'd like. I'm actually was amazed at the response to the invitation. I think what this should tell all of us, take a good look at each other here, because you're all curious about meaning and what matters and our human life and future together. And so even though we haven't talked amongst ourselves all that much except for the break today, you're seeing a community of people that shares something at a heart and head and body level here. Okay? So this is an acknowledgement of a kind of community that's already at play here in Bend. Okay, so I'm so appreciative that we're asking these questions together and willing to come together and take time to do that. So I invite you to return again next month. Bill and I talked a little bit about some topics for next month. And because it's December, we thought that we would explore a little bit some of the themes that are classic for the Christian tradition, which is Advent, which is about darkness and light and the coming and expectation. And so we'll talk a little bit about the narrative of the December season. And I think we'll take some time to unpack the birth narratives a little bit and what they say and what they don't and what they're about and maybe what they're not. So we'll just unpack those birth narratives a bit because they're actually very, very interesting, even if they're not completely historical. But they tell us more than perhaps just a flat line historical data points might tell us. So come back for more conversation. I'm also going to ask my beloved webmaster, her name is Elisa Chang, to put on our website feedback. So if you have some suggestions for what you'd like to see more of or less of, please give us some feedback through the website. We'll pay attention to that. Or if you have some suggestions for how you might like to see this conversation continue to unfold, don't be shy about it, okay? Give us some feedback. That'll help it'll help be a gift to all of us, okay? So, to close, I want to read the ending of a poem of Mary Oliver's. It's well known to many of you, I'm sure. It's called When Death Comes. It was my very favorite poem about 5 years ago, and then death came. It's still one of my favorite poems. But I'm going to read the last part of this poem, and I'm going to read it twice. And then I'm going to read a quote from Stephen Hawking. And I'm going to have these two quotes be a bit of guidance for us as we continue our conversations over these next several months. Okay? First from Mary Oliver. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I have made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. When it's over, I want to say, all my life, I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I've made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. When it's over, I want to say, all my life, I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. May it be so for us. And from Stephen Hawking, try to make sense of what you have seen and wonder about what makes the universe exist. It matters you don't give up. Unleash your imagination. Shape the future. Try to make sense of what you have seen and wonder about what makes the universe exist. It matters you don't give up. Unleash your imagination. Shape the future. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
See you next month.